Ladies and gentlemen, the review for The Alliance by Varanus. Varanus is a storied gentleman responsible for 3 individual campaigns. This is the earliest of his works, and surprisingly enough, or perhaps not so surprisingly, after all, it is one of the most RTS-like experiences that he has created out of the 3 campaigns that we have played. Now, admittedly, to Varanus's limited credit, all of his campaigns involved a heavy macro component. And perhaps we would have seen even more macro stuff out of Palinchron Concordance had it ever been finished. Or perhaps it was finished, but we lost the last 4 maps or whatever. Either way, we did not play the last part of that campaign, so we can't really say. But I think it's interesting to look back at the other campaigns that we experienced from Varanus, given this context, given the context of the Alliance, and the fact that, Resurgence and Palinchron Concordance, they deviated from the tried and true sort of method of just running a generic AI and having a fairly open map with lots of expansions. I think back to maybe the early missions of After Brood War by Gabble, or I don't know, just like some of the basic missions that you might see in Retribution, or even early stages of Insurrection. Well, I guess not early stages, because the first missions of that campaign were a disaster, but the idea being that it's very stripped down, very lo-fi, and very unimpressive, very unceremonious, but still not a bunch of gimmicks. And the later campaigns of Varanus did veer off into gimmick territory. Now, admittedly, the last stages of the Alliance also veered off into gimmick territory, but it took a little bit longer than you might have expected, given the rest of Varanus's back catalog. So this being his first campaign, a little surprising to me because of the fact that it is mostly straightforward macro missions. There's like 1 token shitty micro mission in the first 3 of the 4 episodes. So you pretty much just ignore those because they're over in about 5 minutes, especially if you shit campaign the EXE the way I do. So it works out. Oh, by the way, a shitcampaign.exe is available for download if you need it. It's somewhere in my tools folder. You can find it on the wiki. Pretty useful, I gotta say. So, yeah, a campaign that was without a mod. I do believe that Resurgence and I certainly know Palinchron Concordance had a mod. Resurgence did as well. So, Varanus did almost immediately correct that error by modding, but he didn't really mod the right things. He just ticked boxes in DAT edit. So it wasn't anything impressive like AI editing or anything like that. This one was even less impressive in that department because it had no mod. Certainly had a very bizarre approach to its story. Varanus quickly seems to have realized that he needed to invent canon or non-canon characters and tell stories away from the default Blizzard stories. I don't know if this is because he just wanted to have voice acting and didn't feel confident emulating the voice of any of the other lines or any of the other characters, but I can fan fiction in my own head the idea that he realized Blizzard stories are boring, and he wanted to tell stories that were not boring. His stories were boring, but that's okay. The story of the Alliance is almost, I guess it's like an After Brood War version of Brood War, because it's meant to be a sequel to the vanilla Starcraft experience. In fact, I guess it must have come out before Brood War, or before he had played Brood War, because all of these maps were SCM, not SCX, so they were all vanilla compatible. And so I can only imagine that Varanus actually was just trying to make a sequel to a game that he liked, which is, I guess, a worthy enough goal, in theory, a worthy enough sort of standard to hold yourself to, try to make an enjoyable sequel. Of course, the story was batshit insane, and despite the fact that it was batshit insane, maybe it was the absence of voice acting that helped the writing feel a little bit more taken seriously than what we experienced in his later works. But still very funny to me that we wound up dealing with some very, very silly things like the Strain Lords and having certain characters study under other characters, and Tarask was somebody's mentor or something. Just very, very silly stuff. So anyway, the bottom line is we do indeed have a very strange premise for a campaign, but certainly is interesting to see people actually trying to make a sequel to vanilla StarCraft as opposed to a sequel to Brood War. And also kind of funny that he took a much more common sense approach to storytelling when it comes to the Zerg, where Kerrigan is a lackey to Daggeth, and Daggeth is actually the successor. Kind of funny to me that obviously Blizzard threw that out the door and decided, let's actually make Kerrigan the big bad. Okay, Blizzard. Okay, Metzen. I see what you did there. So anyway, that aside, we should obviously comment on the fact that we had a very annoying time with the campaign as time went on, and this is actually one of the few campaigns I've ever played where a key victory condition in almost every single map was to destroy every single unit. This includes spider mines, observers, and other permanently hidden units. So I was mostly flying around with an overlord in half the campaign missions for the last 10 minutes. Or it was 10 minutes game time. I was always speeding it up with the shit campaign EXE patch. I mean, that's why I do that. It's just so crazy to me that that's real. That is actually real. That's a real thing that a real person really did. And that's one of those things that really irons out my argument, I feel like. Adds a lot of ammo to the position of nobody tests their maps. I mean, who in their right mind would actually test a map where the objective was to kill every single cloaked observer and borrowed spider mine? Or borrowed Zergling, as it sometimes was. Why? Why is that real? Now, the most puzzling thing is, in usually the last mission of each episode, the objective actually changes from every last unit to just every building, which is more acceptable, but still not acceptable. And the idea that that would be acceptable to Varanus really is strange. The idea that he would adapt or adopt that process and change his process in that way for just a handful of missions. Why? Why is this not the victory condition always? And then I think there was at least one mission where just killing off all of the main structures rendered them neutral, but maybe I'm conflating that with map crap. I don't remember, honestly. It has been a few days since I've actually played this campaign. But I did just timestamp all the VODs, so I'm somewhat kept up to speed. That being said, it was certainly a strange, wild run. I don't think there's really a whole lot to analyze at the end of the day because it is so very much bare bones. And as I was talking about earlier, a lot of the level design is very unceremonious, very unimpressive, very aggravating in some cases where you had to really wind your way around. I did talk about this in the Ascension of Duran playthrough and review about the AI having a host of pre-placed units and a pretty annoying starting location relative to what tools you have to actually attack into them. So there's a high amount of defender's advantage without it feeling earned because of the AI's tactical positioning in the middle of the match. Varanus actually scores higher in this regard. There were several maps, at least there were 2 or 3 maps. I don't know about how many others because I didn't look at every single map in the campaign in the editor. But there were quite a few maps where the AI started out with nothing, just 4 workers and a command center, or whatever, a town hall. I think that's really interesting. I think it's very, very funny to me that Varanus, of all people, the most unlikely unsung hero, is responsible for AI that do that, instead of having a bunch of pre-placed shit. And also really funny to me that he seems to have completely abandoned that idea in favor of pre-placing millions of spore colonies in Palinchon Concordance maps. So I don't really know what happened there. But really interesting that he wound up doing that for a few of the AIs in some of his maps. Now, obviously, he didn't make any of his own custom AI. And it is one of those things that really saddens me because I know that Bob Fitch, the AI programmer guy, was actually interested in creating an AI editor module inside StarEdit way back when. And the idea that this functionality would later be carried over by fan-made editors such as SCM Draft 2, if you change one thing about history and you just change that little bit when it comes to Brood War, don't like kill Hitler or anything. Just change that, and suddenly you'd have so many campaigns that where the precedent would be set. Hey, write some AI, man. Make some custom AI for yourself, and man, the whole game would look very different. I think, sort of like a functioning version of the Warcraft 3 one that's horribly broken. Yeah, something like that. It would have been great. I think Varanus also would agree. And would have been able to explore some different options with his level design and his AIs and all that. Now, that being said, I do think that there's a certain expectation that the player has when they're going back into a campaign from 1998, like the Alliance is. A campaign that doesn't deliberately restrict itself to vanilla because Brood War literally wasn't out when this campaign was made, or maybe he didn't own it at the time of making it. A very, very old artifact of ancient history, pretty much, at this point. That being said, it was still a more palatable experience despite all of my grinding and complaining in the playthrough. Looking back at it, I would much rather have to play through this again than play a lot of the other campaigns that I've had to play more recently, like Ass of Duran, or I guess if you go back much further, like Insurrection. I guess Retribution and the Alliance are probably somewhat similar in terms of the quality control. Perhaps Retribution's missions are a little bit easier, so maybe that campaign would get a little bit more attention from me, but I think it's also a lot quicker to blaze through the Alliance, or maybe it's if you know what you're doing anyway. So anyway, the point is, if I had to go back and suffer through another experience, the Alliance would actually not be high on the list of worst, if you know what I mean. And so I think that's fair. That's the closest thing that you're going to get as praise in one of these reviews when you're so far off the beaten path, and you're not making content in 2020 when we actually have an AI debug plugin and ways to track certain things and ways to mod and all these tools and all this documentation. Now, certainly you should use the tools that you have at your disposal to the fullest potential, and nobody did that. Certainly nobody in the custom content space, anyway, the custom campaign space. But when it comes to working within the confines of Star Edit and 1998, and just trying to make a campaign series that involves you playing StarCraft, Varanus was surprisingly competent, and probably more competent in this campaign than his other works going forward, despite the fact that this campaign unfortunately did lack the trademark Varanus voice acting that I've come to expect and haunts me in my dreams whenever I remember that Vision of the Future, Episode 3, Prophecy, is a real thing. Man, I wish that was the truth for every single Vision of the Future campaign. We need to petition Varanus to come back and revoice all of Vision of the Future. I will then play it again, even if there's no gameplay changes. That alone will make it worthwhile. So, while you head on over to change.org and send that up, I think Varanus doxed himself in one of these campaigns, so you can probably find him on Facebook or something. I can't because I don't use Facebook, but you can because you suck. You are a casual. Get out of my channel. All right, so I've ticked off a bunch of boxes here. I've shat on Ass of Duran. I've shat on my audience. Shat on Facebook. Did I shit on Remastered yet? I did not. But just saying Remastered is kind of shitting on it. What else? Actually, talking about the campaign, I think I did that for long enough. I mean, really, it's not that deep of a puzzle to solve. It's really a very forgettable experience, I guess. But a couple of things do stand out. The fact that the campaigns that Varanus would later go on to create were less impressive somehow. And the fact that the story was such a strange, garbled mess, that was also something that stood out. I mean, not really standing out in the same sense as what you would expect. That most campaigns are like that, I guess. But it was unique in the way that it was a mess. What else? I guess we have, of course, the whole AI spiel that I had earlier, where he actually does start out some of the AI with nothing. I think that's neat. I wish more people had actually explored that idea. Varanus seems to be actually the only one that I can think of that comes to mind that I've played anyway. So maybe somebody in the comments can correct me on that one. But people ask me sometimes, like, are there any campaigns that start you out in like a quote unquote melee environment? Well, you as a player never did that. And certainly the maps were not fit for melee style art, like large scale RTS combat, generally speaking, because of the asinine nature in which the pathways were laid out. And the pathfinding system actually broke. And I think the last mission, the very, very last mission, you go back and watch that was a really annoying one. And also a very gimmicky one. Like I said, the gimmicks started to crop up more and more as you progress through the campaign, particularly culminating in the last one, which was not quite as infuriating as, like, for example, the last Insurrection mission, but pretty fucking annoying. and also very obviously dysfunctional that any testing would have told you, hey, this isn't working. So, yeah. But I do think that there's some element of interest and intrigue in the fact that this campaign is so old, and yet it ends up being better than Varanus' later work and better than a lot of other people's work, like more palatable, again, more tolerable. So, I guess that's peculiar about it. That's my lasting take away from it anyway. Having been almost a week since I've sat down the campaign and had a lot of time to think about it, and I didn't think about it for too much in that time because it's not a campaign that's very thought-provoking, but that one does stand out. The fact that I would actually rather play this again than most of the other content that came out since. So, whatever. Take the W's that you can take, Varanus. And thanks for being an emoji on my Discord server. Bye.